Good morning, community. It is good to be with you this morning. Welcome to the tropical rainforest that is Naperville. I don't know about you, I saved on gas and just swam here this morning. We're glad that you're here, though. I gotta confess something. I think the different developmental stages of kids is fascinating. Having our first kid and learning what's happening in his brain and what's going to happen in the next months and years, I think it's just endlessly intriguing. And I think maybe one of my favorite sort of phases or stages of childhood development is what I'm going to call the why stage. Anyone ever interacted with a child during the why stage? They just ask why. There's groans in the sections, right? I remember one of the first real interactions I had with this was years ago. I was back home in Detroit with my family, and my eldest niece was smack dab in the middle of the why phase. And she said, "Uncle Ian, can we please go outside and play?" And I said, "Actually, my dear, we can't right now because it's raining outside." She goes, "Why?" I go, "Because water is falling from the sky." "Why?" "Because it was gathered, it was in the cloud for some reason, now it's coming down." "Why?" Because of vapor or something, I don't, "Why?" And I go, I don't know. That's the end of the things that I know. That's the exhaustive list. I don't know anymore. "Why?" "Because I didn't pay attention in school, okay? I don't know. I just wasn't focused." "Why?" "Because it didn't seem that important to me at the time, and I was just really distracted by the people around me." "Why?" "Because I wanted people to like me, and so I was always the class clown and talking when I shouldn't have been talking." "Why?" I'm gonna go ahead and stop you right here, just out of courteousness to the rest of you. This went on for a while, and it got really esoteric and very metaphysical, to the point where it was like, why? Because some things are and some things are not, okay? I don't know how to explain it any further. And here's the thing with the kid in the why stage, they never ever say, "Oh, well, that explains it. Thanks for telling me that." Right? That point never comes. And I was thinking about that story this week and how sometimes as adults, don't we behave the same way? When it comes to our lives and the things that happen within them, don't we sometimes feel like that 4-year-old that just endlessly asks why? Why did this happen? Why is this the way that it is? Throughout this series, we've been tackling a couple of these, what we're calling bumper sticker phrases, and we're asking a key question. Is it biblically sound or just sound biblical? Is it biblically sound, or does it just have enough sort of Christian flavor to it that we don't really ask and dive deeper into whether or not it's actually true? And the phrase that I want to tackle today, I think, is maybe the one that we've said the most. It's the one that I've heard the most certainly, and the phrase is this: everything happens for a reason. Anyone here ever said that before in some context? Ever heard it before? I know that I've certainly both heard and said it myself. And I think often the people that say a phrase like this, they mean really well, right? We mean it to be helpful or encouraging, when your friend doesn't get the job they applied for, or your teenager gets dumped, or your neighbor still hasn't won Hamilton tickets yet after 3,000 tries. Well, everything happens for a reason, right? My question, though, is what's really going on behind that statement? I think often when we say things like this, we're trying to make meaning out of pain, right? We're trying to in some way wrap our finite brains around this thing that's happened or happening that we can't see any logical reason for, and so we often jump to phrases like this. If I could at least believe everything happens for a reason, then maybe at least in this moment, this won't feel so painful. And honestly, I feel like most of us say it because we don't know what else to say, right? Anyone ever had someone share with you some great pain or sorrow, and it's out of your discomfort, you're like, everything happens for a reason. I think often we say it because we're uncomfortable with someone else's pain. Now, in the case of someone not getting the job they applied for, right? If they later applied for a different, better job, a higher paying job, well, man, that's easy then, right? Everything happens for a reason. You didn't get that first job because that job was terrible. Now you have the job of your dreams. But what about, though, when someone close to you is in like a tragic accident, or they're given just a devastating diagnosis, or the whole thing just starts to unravel, the whole bottom drops out. What if someone's the victim of a violent crime? Then what do we say? What if you're like my friend Sherry, who faced some unthinkable circumstances?
My name is Sherry Banky, and I've been part of Community almost 18 years now. In August of 2000, I was getting ready for work in what was becoming a new normal. It was the new normal because my husband would have typically been at work at that time, but he was home. He was home because he had just spent a month-long stay in the hospital at Northwestern recovering from a stem cell transplant. He had the stem cell transplant because we had had 2 years of unsuccessful treatment for Hodgkin's lymphoma. On that morning, while getting ready, there was a major thunderstorm going on, and there was a lightning strike that was very close to our home, physically shook our home, and I thought, wow, that's close. My husband became concerned that there may be damage outside. I encouraged him to go back to bed. He didn't listen to me. He got dressed and went outside to check if there was any damage outside. My husband came back inside and shouted, "The house is on fire." And so I quickly grabbed my daughter. I woke her up. Actually, we had to grab clothes, run outside, and we stood in the pouring rain waiting for the fire department to arrive. And it was just surreal. It was overwhelming. Life was so hard already. 2 years of cancer treatment that weren't working, raising my daughter, working full time, stem cell transplant, month-long stay in the hospital, and now my house was burning. And it was just exasperating. I didn't know if I should laugh or cry. And I just wondered, what is the reason for all of this?
So what would you say to Sherry if you were standing with her in the pouring rain with her sick husband, watching their house burn to the ground? Would you say everything happens for a reason, Sherry? Right? Let go and let God. The truth of the matter is there are a lot of us in this room right here and now that you're actually familiar with that level of pain. And it can be incredibly difficult, impossible even, to feel like I can even get my brain around what's happening right now to me, to those that I love. And so I want to ask, what are we actually saying when we use this phrase, everything happens for a reason? What's really going on behind that? Because I think what's going on behind that statement is the belief that everything that happens is God's will. Everything that happens is God's will. And this, in theology, is what we call determinism. This idea of determinism really is in a way declaring that nothing happens outside of the determination of God. That every single activity, interaction, God willed that. He determined that thing to happen. And if he's controlling everything, well, then we can rest easy knowing that ultimately God has some good reason for determining what happened to me, to you, to a loved one, to a friend, a relative. And there are a lot of reasons that this sounds biblical. I think one of the passages most commonly kind of referenced in sort of making that case comes from Matthew 10. And in Matthew chapter 10, I'll set the scene. Jesus is sending out the disciples, and they're about to do a whole lot of things. They're gonna preach the kingdom, they're gonna heal the sick, they're gonna cast out demons. And in this chapter, Jesus is warning them, hey, some stuff's gonna happen to you too. You're gonna be ridiculed, you're gonna be pummeled, you're gonna be imprisoned. Things are going to be a little rough in the midst of this ministry that I've called you to. And here's what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 10. He says, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care." So really, essentially what Jesus is saying is, you don't have to fear people because their power is limited. You don't have to be afraid of whatever opposition is about to come your way because their power is limited. And then he reassures them, listen, you're way more valuable than birds, okay? You're way more valuable than a couple of sparrows, a couple of doves, a couple of birds. You're way more valuable than them. Now, some have read this passage, though, to mean that nothing happens unless God determines that thing to happen. Determinism. Nothing happens apart from God's involvement. But in this picture, God is kind of like a grand puppet master, right? He's the puppet master pulling all the strings. So like if you're at work and your computer freezes up, like God was like pulling the computer strings that day. Probably, gave you a Mac. I'm kidding. You get a flat tire on the way home, right? God was like he's pulling the flat tire strings that day, right? Like Nickelback comes on the radio and I can't even joke about that one. That God would never do that to you. But that's exactly what determinism does. It blames God for everything because he's this divine puppet master always pulling the strings. And to say that partially eliminates the concept of personal responsibility for our own actions, right? Like if I run a red light, well, God must have just willed for me to run that red light. If I cheat on my spouse, God must have willed for me to cheat on my spouse. If I steal from my boss, God must have willed for me to do that. I remember years ago, there was a guy in my office, and he just started confessing stuff, and it was really mostly circling around how bad of a husband he had been. And he's just listing all these, he was really just not paying attention, was being really rude, being really critical. And he had shared that after about 20 minutes of sharing that his wife was making him sleep on the couch. And then he turns to me and goes, well, everything happens for a reason. And I was like, no, those are just called consequences for being a jerk. Like, we don't need to over-spiritualize you sleeping on the couch. You're being a jerk, and she made you sleep on the couch, rightfully so. So often in determinism, it really allows us to sort of stand back and say, well, I guess God must have willed that then. I can't be responsible for running that red light or stealing from my boss or cheating on my spouse. In this view, it blames God for everything. And can you see why this would be dangerous? I mean, sure, running red lights is one thing, but does that mean that God then determined every rape, every murder, every violent crime? Does it make sense then that maybe people who were handed that version of God walked away and said, if that's true, I want nothing to do with that God? In fact, I would say, who can blame them? I mean, if your eyes are even partially open to the brokenness in our world, if the response is, well, God must have a reason for willing that to happen, can you understand why that would be really problematic for someone who's maybe exploring the idea of the possibility of a relationship with God? Yeah, he determined that, but I'm sure he had a reason. Okay, so let me just pause for a moment, because I do know that in a room this size, there are many of us who right now are going through unthinkable pain and sorrow. And if any of us ever spouted a phrase like, everything happens for a reason, please hear me in this. I am so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'd bet that person was well-meaning. I'll bet they were trying to take away some of your pain, and in so doing likely caused more. But let me say this as clearly as I can. Whatever tragedy, whatever heartbreak, whatever thing that you're in the midst of right now, God did not determine that thing to happen in your life. God doesn't give cancer. It's burn down homes. God's heart breaks when our heart breaks, full stop. From Genesis to Revelation, we're given a picture of a loving Father, that when our heart breaks, his heart breaks as well. So then are we saying that God has no control, no involvement in anything? No, we're not saying that either. That's called deism, and deism is the idea that God just sort of created the world, he sort of spun it on its axis and sort of walked away. He's like the absentee landlord. Now, God's not a micromanager, nor is he an absentee landlord. But to better understand, though, how this works, how sometimes bad, tragic things happen, we need to talk about the word dominion. Now, the concept of dominion really begins at the very beginning of the story in the book of Genesis. When God was creating the world, he was literally speaking the world into existence. Everything that he said became, and he was creating a good world in his good order. And every time he would step back and he would declare it good. He'd speak, he'd create, he'd declare it good, and God had dominion over all of it. But then, at the pinnacle of creation, God makes humans, man and woman, and he invites them to share in this dominion over the world. This is called the cultural mandate. He says, look around you. Look at the animals, look at the mountains, look at the trees, look at the landscape. It's all yours. Dream, create, organize, develop to keep my good order. He enters into this really special relationship with humankind. He shares the dominion for this newly created world. In fact, this psalmist, I think, tries to capture this idea here in Psalm chapter 8. It says, what is mankind that you're mindful of them? Human beings, that you care for them. You've made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet, all flocks and herds, the animals of the wild, the birds in the sky and the fish in the sea, all that swim the paths of the seas. So God creates this new world, and then he creates humans and says, you now share in this work of dreaming and creating and organizing and developing. We join in this unique relationship with God in this shared dominion. But God also then took a risk in doing that, didn't he? Right? To invite humans into that relationship was a risk. Would humans continue the good order that God created them to maintain, or would they choose their own ways? We see pretty early in this story how that ends up going. The serpent confronts Eve in the garden. And regardless of what you heard, really what the serpent is tempting Eve is to doubt God's goodness. Is that really the path to wholeness, to fullness, to shalom? Did you really hear God correctly? Was God maybe just not totally on his game that day? Begins to whisper, no. God's trying to keep something from you. God's trying to keep you from having fun. He's trying to keep you from full joy. And so Eve, along with Adam, they exercise their dominion and they make a choice to go against God's good order. Now this story establishes a pattern that's repeated over and over and over again, all the way to me, to us. Every day we're given choices to continue God's good order or to make choices that better suit us, our selfish desires. And we all, I think, could agree that none of us are batting 1,000, right? Shalom is this fracturing of the wholeness and fullness that God created the world in. And even if you're not a Jesus follower, if you're not a church person, I think we can all acknowledge, I can see some ways that I've contributed to fracturing the shalom of the way the universe was created to work. We exercise our own dominion to go against God's good order, which leads us to a truth that I think is rather sobering this morning, that not everything that happens is God's will. Not everything that happens is God's will. Many choices are made that go against God's good order. His desire for us relationally, individually, communally, as far as the planet is concerned. In fact, I think this is why Jesus himself urged us to pray this way. To pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. What does that mean? It means that there are rival kingdoms. It means that his will is not always done on earth as it is in heaven. That's why he challenges us to pray that way. It means sometimes choices are made that go against the way that God wired and designed us to live. Choices of our own free will, our own dominion. So the fact that God's will isn't always done on earth means that not everything happens for a reason. Not everything happens for a reason. Sometimes things happen because we made a mistake. Sometimes things happen because someone else made a mistake. Sometimes things happen because whole societal structures were built to stand in opposition to God's good order. And sometimes there is no explainable reason why something happens. And if in the midst of your pain and heartache, someone said, well, everything must happen for a reason, please hear me again. I am so sorry. So let me Let me pause just for a moment, because I know that this is probably rattling some of us. Because this phrase is so common that it actually can be really, really difficult to begin to like loosen our grip around it, right? Like it's so common and it sounds so right that this can be really unnerving to even talk about dismantling the truth behind the statement. But let me assure you that we do not have to lose heart. We do not have to lose heart. That no matter what happens in this life, we can know that we have hope. Jesus entered our broken world, and through his life, death, and resurrection is redeeming and restoring all things. He said to evil, sickness, violence, and darkness, give it your best shot, and he exhausted its force. The cross is the declaration that when evil did its very worst, Jesus comes out on top. Jesus remains victorious. He defeated this brokenness, and he set in motion God's new order, his new world, and that we as Christ followers, we're the agents that bring life and healing and truth and goodness and mercy and forgiveness and beauty wherever we are in the world. In our families, in our communities, where we go to work, where we vacation, every bit of it. God says, you're now my agents of this redemption, of this healing, of this redeeming, of God healing that which is broken. That's what it means to be a Christ follower. To heal that which is broken, to bring light where there is darkness. It's not just so that we get sucked up out of here and go to heaven when we die. It's to bring life and meaning and purpose, and sometimes that's to simply sit and grieve with someone whose heart is broken. No platitudes, no sanctimonies. To just be present as Jesus was and is present. And we have a promise that every day everything will be made right. Revelation reads this way: he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Does that sound like good news to anybody this morning? The old order, the way that things had been done, has gone. Jesus ushers in a new way of living, not in an afterlife, but here and now. That whatever brokenness or grief or pain or sorrow we or anyone we know is dealing with, God offers hope. He offers fullness. That's the hope that we have, and until that hope is realized, we can cling to this promise of Romans 8. So we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose, which is another way of saying this: God can use everything that happens for a reason. God can use everything that happens for a reason. And not only can he wants to. I think it's so easy to buy into this idea that like God's annoyed with our presence, like we're unwanted house guests in his home. Whatever brokenness you brought in here this morning, whatever pain or sorrow you might even be in the midst of right now, not only can God, he wants to. He wants to take that brokenness, that pain, that shame, that sorrow, and make something beautiful from it. He can take even the darkest, most twisted parts of our lives and make them something absolutely stunning, to bring good from them. He can bring beauty from ashes, light from darkness, and hope from despair.
When my house was struck by lightning, I didn't even have a relationship with God at that time. We had to move out. We had temporary housing set up at the High Point Apartments, and we discovered that there was a church in the community center there. So we decided to go to church. And after a few weeks, I experienced God in an undeniable way and found my way back to him. I don't believe that God gave my husband cancer, struck my house with lightning, so I would move to this community center and find my way back to him. I've learned that that's just not the loving God that we have. I've learned that bad things happen, and bad things happen for no good reason sometimes. I still have questions. There are things that I really don't understand. One of them is I don't understand why cancer treatment is so brutal. and then people die. Like if it was brutal, but then you survived, I could understand that. But why would somebody suffer from a brutal treatment for years and then die? I don't understand that, and that doesn't seem like a good reason. I don't understand why my daughter had to grow up without her dad. I came from a home that experienced divorce. My husband did too, and we just did not want that to be part of our story. We worked really hard to make sure that wasn't part of our story, but that didn't happen. Here's what I do know. I know that when life had me pinned to the ground, it was the undeniable love of God that picked me up. It was the undeniable love of God that gave me strength to hold my husband's hand when he took his last breath. It was the undeniable power of God that comforted me in overwhelming grief. It was the hope of Jesus that helped me live life and life to the full. And it was the hope of Jesus knowing that death, disease, and disaster doesn't have the final word. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I've overcome the world." And I believe that to be true.
To those of us in this room right now who are in the midst of unthinkable pain and tragedy or sorrow, I don't know why those things are happening. I won't pretend to know. I just don't know. What I do know, though, is that it can't be because God doesn't love us. And all we have to do is look at the cross. Why intervene at all? Why death on a cross of all things? I don't know why those things are happening to you, but I do know that it cannot be because God does not love us. And if you're here this morning and you feel alone, you feel abandoned, you are not alone. You are not abandoned. There is a God who loves you and sees you fully and calls you beloved. Says, "You are my son, you are my daughter," and he joins us in the midst of our pain and suffering. And for all of us, whether we're suffering today or not, my prayer is that we would be a people who are present, speak little, and pray a lot. Who let go of the need to explain everything away, to simply mourn with those who mourn, to sit with those who suffer, to be present, to remind each other every single day. Man, it's not always easy, but we are not alone. I'm in this with you. We're in this together. We're better together. The point isn't to simply explain it away with some pithy truism, but to together be made more aware of God's presence working in our midst right here and now. May we be a people who link arms together, let go of the need to always try to explain stuff away, to celebrate with those who celebrate, but to also mourn with those who mourn, and in so doing, open our eyes to the ways God is working right under our noses. Would you pray with me, please? God, thank you that, first and foremost, you are a good God. And God, I confess personally for often saying phrases like this one because it has more to do with my discomfort than the pain of a friend, because I don't know what to say, because I don't know how to sit with them in it. God, may we be a people of faithful presence in a world that goes so fast that only skims the surface. God, may we drill down deep to be present with one another, to remind each other that sometimes we just don't have answers. But God, that we can cling to the promise that even when we don't have answers, we know that there is not a single thing that is too far for you to redeem. There's not a thing so dark that you can't bring light into. God, may we be people of light wherever we are. We thank you, we love you, God, and we pray all these things in the beautiful, healing name of Jesus. Amen.